In May of 2020, FreightWaves Live is headed back to the largest freight market in the Southeast, Atlanta, Georgia. Join FreightWaves for our best event yet, featuring captivating keynote speakers and rapid-fire demos of technology that is sure to take our industry to the next level. This is your opportunity to interact with some of the most innovative leaders as we mark a new decade in transportation. See you in Atlanta May 5th and 6th.
Hello and welcome to this Tuesday edition of FreightWaves Now. I'm your host Anthony Smith, and coming up we have Donny Gilbert giving us a broker update. I'll be stepping in for a shipper econ update, but first a word from Strickland with a carrier update brought to you by PowerFleet. Stay tuned.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this carrier update presented by PowerFleet. So, tender rejection rates year over year. We've got this green line here. That is last year's tender rejection rate, 8.42% this time last year. Right now we're sitting about 7.57% overall tender rejection rate in the country right now. What this indicates to me is that we are actually seeing a convergence of these tender rejections year over year. Last year we were falling out of that heavy 2018, super hot market. Now we're starting to kind of level out as we enter the middle of January, which is not necessarily that expected. Capacity is tightening in certain parts of the country, not everywhere in general, and this does not mean that the spot market is blowing up with freight by any means. But this is an interesting development as we enter the middle of January, which is traditionally one of the softest times for the freight market. So let's check out and see where in the country we can expect some of this tightness to exist. So up here around the Detroit area, Boston, Massachusetts, this is not a big market, and you certainly don't want to just head into Boston blindly without a load already pre-planned, but you should see a little bit more opportunity here versus this time last week. So what this is doing is measuring weighted tender rejections overall in the country. So it's going to take into account market share and tender rejection weekly change. So anything in blue, we're going to see decreasing capacity week over week. Anything in red, loosening capacity week over week. So we've got some dark red in these bigger markets here around Harrisburg, etc., Columbus, Grand Rapids, down here around Atlanta market. Some of the bigger markets themselves are very loose, and they are continuing to get looser. What you need to pay attention for, however, are these blue markets right in here. So around here in North Carolina, Charlotte. Again, does not mean that there's going to be blowing up spot market activity in these areas, but it does mean that week over week we are seeing a transition to a tighter market than we saw last week. And overall, these darker blues are going to be weighted against the overall country. So that means that these are going to be the tightest areas of the country. Again, not necessarily saying that there's going to be explosive spot market activity and you're going to see 20% margins overnight, but it means that you are going to be able to use this information to probably source your loads a little bit more effectively in terms of week over week activity. So looking at the list here of the weighted rejection index, I should say, you see the Charlotte market is number one today, along with down here Ontario and Los Angeles, California. So Ontario, the second biggest market in the country, seeing an increase in weighted tender rejection rates. So this is very important stuff to look at in terms of if you're trying to manage your fleet and you're definitely, week over week activity, you can accept more freight going into these markets. So looking at the Charlotte market here, this is the tender rejection rate for van, reefer, and just basic tender rejection. So contrary to the rest of the country, it's really starting to pick back up in the Charlotte market. Reefer rejections spiking all the way up to 19.87% yesterday. Van rejection rates are increasing as well down there at 10.14%. So that means you are going to see a little bit more increasing opportunity out of the Charlotte market here in the last 7 days or so. But more importantly, let's look at the Los Angeles and Ontario markets. So reefer rejection rates, not doing a lot out of Los Angeles. Not the time of year yet. We need to wait a couple of months so far. But van rejection rates starting to inch up. This is important to note as we have Chinese New Year hitting here in a little bit, so the port activity is bound to increase here shortly. Overall, mid-haul rejection rates and tweener rejection rates, some of the tightest lengths of haul in that area are right now today. So if you are a carrier looking for freight out of Los Angeles, you should have increasing opportunity out of that. Again, your margins may not be getting over 10% or so, or 5% even, but certainly be aware that this does exist for increasing opportunities for utilization. And that'll do it for today's Carrier Update.
The comprehensive logistics offerings from PowerFleet cover in-cab ELD, fleet management, trailer tracking, cargo monitoring, and tracking other assets such as chassis and intermodal containers. Power up your operations with PowerFleet.
Thank you, Zach. Today here we're going to look at the head haul index for our update for our brokerage right now. So our head haul index measures the kind of the flow of freight into and outbound, into and out of a market for all the markets across the U.S. And what we do is we take our outbound tendered freight and we subtract out our inbound tendered freight, and of course that's going to give us a positive or a negative number depending on is there more outbound freight or is there more inbound freight into that market, and of course how strong are those numbers. We get excited when the numbers cross about 25, and that kind of tells us if a market is tightening up. 0 is a balanced market, and of course a negative market is more or less a backhaul market. So today I brought up our Salt Lake City market here, and I brought up our head haul index, and we see it has a head haul index of 32.55. Which, I said above 25, that's kind of exciting. It shows that there's a lot more outbound freight than there is inbound freight, which is giving our carriers a lot more options. But what we brought out this week, we can now break this down by a reefer head haul index or a drive-in head haul index, which is very important because it can tell a totally different story than just looking at our head haul index all in general together. So what I want to look at here next is our drive-in head haul index, and you can see where it's picking up, but it's only up to 7.37 index points. Now 7.37 is actually a very low number. It's really showing that it's a balanced market. So our head haul index in general showed 32, but now that we can see our drive-in is only 7.37. So it's kind of a little bit different. Is it extremely tight? No, it's not. It's actually very loose when it comes to the drive-in side, or kind of closer to a balanced market. Now, looking at our reefer, it is actually, we can see where it has dropped down, but it's still at 36.81. And of course, that's very exciting. It's over 25. We can see here that our reefer capacity has tightened here throughout the last week, and now it's kind of flattened out, but it's dropped down, but it still remains elevated. So here we can see that in the Salt Lake City market, our reefer head haul index shows 36. It's tight, and that could be the reason that our reefer tender rejection rates are over 30% for today. Now, one of our favorite maps here, we can throw this into, or actually let's look at Memphis here right quick first. I brought up Memphis here so that we can put all this together. Here are our outbound tender volumes, 152.65 index points. And I brought here and I put in our green line, the drive-in head haul is at 47, and our reefer here is at 4.66. And this is kind of backwards what was going on in the Salt Lake City market. Here we had a lot higher head haul index, but it was the reefer that was peaking. Here in Memphis, we have a lot higher drive-in, which is 47, and of course it's well over the 25, but our reefer here you can see is very low. It's more of a balanced market. Now, one of my favorite maps that I always like to look at is our tree maps. And I've brought up here both the van head haul index and the reefer head haul index. And we start here at the top left corner of these markets. These are going to be the markets with the highest head haul indexes, and of course the bottom right hand is going to be our lowest. But since we have positive and negative numbers, right here through the middle is where 0 is going to be at. So here to the left is going to be positive markets, and here to the right are going to be negative markets. So you can bring both of these up on head haul indexes and see which markets. You can see Los Angeles here, 82.67. It's got the highest drive-in index for the country for the drive-ins. But break these down, use these, and you can understand how this affects capacity. We don't measure we don't measure deadhead in this index, but you can see the flow of freight of the inbound versus the outbound, which will affect capacity, and that can very quickly affect your spot market rates.
Voices from every corner of the supply chain concerning all modes of transportation. From the world's largest logistics podcast network, this is what the Freight Tech Revolution sounds like. Freightcast presented by FreightWaves. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, I'm Anthony Smith, and welcome to the Shipper Update. Today we're going to take a little bit of an econ spin with it, and behind me I have consumer credit, and we also have retail sales for motor vehicles. So one of the things that just came out was the total consumer spending coming from the Federal Reserve. And so one of the things that we saw from that is that there was a little bit of a mixed bag. So there was a drop in revolving credit, but there was a rise in non-revolving credit. So these are two different areas of credit markets for the U.S. economy. And so what we can see is when there is strong consumer spending or there's strong consumer credit, it really impacts goods entering the economy. This is going to have implications for freight. When we're looking at total credit that's revolving, this is where we saw a decline in the most recent month, and this is one of the areas that can really start to impact some of the spending in the U.S. economy. And as you know, when we're looking at the GDP, the overall economy, the consumer consumption is really going to be a big part of that. And so it's a bit of a mixed bag, especially as we are leaning on the consumer to drive the economy more and more, as other areas of the economy are starting to falter, especially when we're looking at manufacturing and the industrial side. So we're really leaning more and more on the consumer. Now it's a double-edged sword because we also don't want the consumer to overextend themselves. So when we see that there's more and more debt building up and credit ratios are really kind of getting out of whack, and we start to see delinquency rates rising, this is really putting the consumer in a bad position to spend and to really drive any kind of potential freight volumes that would be hauled by dry van or flatbed or even reefers. And so one of the areas that we see here when we're looking at consumer spending is it has a nice relationship with outbound tender rejection rates. And so when we're looking at total personal disposable income, we can see that the trend is similar here. This really kind of drives home the point that when there is spending by the consumer, that there are more durable goods flowing through the economy, that really helps take up capacity overall. So this is really going to be an area that we watch, and an area that we're going to have a little bit of a concern for if we start to see that consumers are starting to overextend themselves. One of the things that we mentioned a little bit early on in the week when we had Andrew Cox on was that some of the wages aren't really keeping pace with the overall economy and when we're starting to see prices go. And so when we're starting to see that consumers are feeling confident because the job market is so tight, one of the areas that we want to be mindful of, that confidence really starts to have consumers lean a little bit more on the credit utilization. And so when we're leaning more on credit utilization, that's really kind of put areas at risk for consumers to help support the overall economy. But again, as I mentioned, double-edged sword, right? So we don't want them to overextend themselves, to put themselves in a bad position. Now, one of the areas that we want to take a quick look at is in the total exports and imports. One of the recent things that we just saw was that the goods exports and imports really start to see that there's been a closing of there. And so we start to see a rise in exports and a decline in imports. And so one of the things that we want to be mindful of is when there are more exports, more imports, this is going to contribute to freight volumes as goods are being hauled to ocean lines and getting hauled off. And so this is going to be an area that's just going to drive freight if we kind of start to see more and more freight volumes. And so I'm pulling this up because one of the things that we have coming up here soon is the phase 1 deal that is pending to go into action. And so this is going to be an area that we're going to monitor closely in the coming weeks to see what kind of effects it's going to have on freight volumes. In particular, this round, we're going to be really monitoring the agricultural side of things. And so that's going to do it for the Shipper Update, and that's also going to bring us to the end of this episode of FreightWaves Now. Thank you so much for tuning in, and the content doesn't stop here. We're always posting around the clock, and we're available on all your favorite social media platforms. We also have our FreightWaves TV app, so we're available on all your favorite streaming platforms as well, including Apple TV. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode.